For 40 years, one country held the entire global economy by the throat, not with the world's largest army, not with the most advanced fighter jets or the deepest nuclear arsenal, with water. 21 miles of water sitting at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, a narrow strip of sea so irreplaceable to global trade that the governments of Asia, Europe, and the developing world had no realistic choice but to accept whatever terms came attached to using it. That corridor is called the Strait of Hormuz, a pinch point between the Iranian coastline to the north and the rugged Omani shore to the south, where at its most constricted the navigable shipping lane narrows to roughly 2 miles wide. Through that gap, on any normal day before the crisis of 2026, more than 100 vessels were making their transit, supertankers loaded with crude oil, carriers filled with liquefied natural gas, cargo ships moving refined petroleum products destined for factories, power stations, and households across 3 continents. Every single one of them funneled through the same 2 miles of water. 1/5 of all oil traded anywhere on the planet passed through this single geographic choke point. Every single day, Iran had spent for decades understanding exactly what that fact was worth. It built accordingly. Naval mines engineered specifically for shallow, confined waterways. Fast attack boats designed for the strait's particular dimensions and current patterns. Coastal missile batteries calibrated precisely on the shipping lanes where tankers were compelled to sail. Electronic warfare systems blanketing the entire corridor and wrapped around all of it, a strategic doctrine built on one simple and utterly devastating promise: push us too far and we close everything. We take the global economy with us into the fire, and nobody will be able to stop us from doing it. And if you want to understand the world at the level most news channels never slow down enough to reach, subscribe right now, because what follows is the full story of how that 40-year threat was finally executed, and why the response to it will permanently alter the way nations exercise power over one another. On March 4th of 2026, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that the Strait of Hormuz was closed to commercial traffic. They did not frame it as a negotiating position. They did not issue it as a warning with a deadline attached. They made clear immediately that any vessel attempting to transit would be targeted, and they followed through without hesitation. Within 8 days, 21 confirmed attacks had been carried out against commercial ships in the corridor. 5 crew members were killed. Tankers that had moved through those waters for decades under an implicit assumption of relative safety found themselves under active missile and drone fire. Traffic through the strait collapsed by 70% almost overnight. More than 150 ships anchored in waters just outside the strait, unable to move forward. Without entering the kill zone, another 200 vessels sat stranded inside the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go. On March 14th, for the first time in recorded maritime history, not a single vessel successfully completed the Hormuz transit. 0 among the roughly 600 ships caught in this paralysis. Approximately 270 were linked to Chinese commercial interests, representing the single largest customer of Gulf energy, accounting for between 37 and 45% of all Hormuz traffic. Oil surged from $65 a barrel to over $100. The International Energy Agency described it as the largest single energy disruption in recorded history. The threat Iran had carried for 4 decades had finally been executed, and in the first hours, everything suggested it had worked exactly as intended. Then something happened that Iran had not fully accounted for. Something quiet and buried and patient was already moving. In the Saudi desert, 1,200 kilometers from the burning strait, a pipeline that had been waiting for precisely this moment for 4.5 decades began running at full capacity for the first time in its existence. To understand what that pipeline meant, you have to go back to 1981. The Iran-Iraq War was at full intensity. Tankers were being struck by missiles in the Persian Gulf. Gulf ports were being bombed. Cargo insurance was being pulled from the entire region. And in Riyadh, a question was being asked that would turn out to be the most strategically consequential question posed in the modern Middle East. What do we do if the strait actually closes? The answer they built was the Petroline, a twin pipeline stretching from Abqaiq, Saudi Arabia's largest oil processing complex sitting deep in the country's interior, all the way to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea coast. The entire route was designed around one strategic principle: it would never touch the Persian Gulf. It would never come within range of whatever threat Iran might eventually deploy at the strait's entrance. It was buried beneath the desert, invisible, patient, and expensive to maintain against a scenario that critics spent decades calling paranoid overinvestment. For 4.5 decades, the Petroline ran well below its maximum capacity. It could move 7 million barrels per day. Typically, it moved closer to 2.8. Critics called it wasteful. The strait had never closed. Why maintain peak operational readiness against a scenario that kept failing to materialize? On March 10th, 6 days after Iran closed the strait, Saudi Aramco's chief executive announced that the Petroline was being brought to full capacity immediately. 7 million barrels per day. The river had already been redirected. The United Arab Emirates had been running the same quiet calculation in parallel. The Habshan-Fujairah pipeline connects Abu Dhabi's inland oil fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman coast, bypassing the Strait of Hormuz entirely without approaching Iranian territorial waters at any point along its route. Its capacity sits Between 1.5 and 1.8 million barrels per day, like the Saudi Petroline, it had been operated conservatively, treated as strategic insurance rather than primary infrastructure. When the strait closed, the way activated it simultaneously with Saudi Arabia. Together, the two systems provided combined bypass capacity of between 8.5 and 9 million barrels per day. That does not solve the entire picture. The pre-crisis Hormuz transit volume was approximately 21 million barrels daily. Iraq's 3 million had no bypass equivalent. Kuwait's 2 million were in the same position. Qatar's enormous liquefied natural gas exports, representing a quarter of all global LNG trade, had no land-based alternative because the physical properties of LNG make pipeline transport over these distances impractical. The existing bypass covered roughly half of what the strait had previously been moving. But what it accomplished was something Iran had not modeled with sufficient seriousness. Saudi Arabia's oil was flowing, the way's oil was flowing. Both of the Gulf's largest producers had successfully decoupled their export infrastructure from the corridor Iran had just closed. Iran's own oil, 2 to 3 million barrels per day, funding 40% of the regime's budget, was now trapped behind the blockade it had created. Its daily economic losses reached between $3 and $4 billion. Foreign exchange reserves began depleting faster than regime planners had calculated. Iran had closed the strait intending mutual destruction. What the pipelines revealed was that the destruction was not mutual at all. Saudi Arabia was not burning alongside Iran, it was exporting. Iran recognized what was being built and it moved to stop it. The drone and missile campaign launched against Gulf bypass infrastructure in the weeks following the strait closure was a strategic acknowledgement that the bypass architecture posed a genuine threat to Iranian leverage. On March 16, Saudi Arabia announced it had intercepted 35 Iranian drones targeting its eastern oil processing region. A fuel storage facility near Dubai International Airport caught fire after a drone attack penetrated defenses. Omani infrastructure sustained damage in strikes that demonstrated Iran's willingness to target neutral states hosting bypass facilities. The message Iran was sending was logical. No bypass route can be permanently secured. If we can hit the Petroline, if we can strike Fujairah, if we can reach Khor Fakkan, then the bypass is not a reliable alternative to accepting Iranian terms at Hormuz. The problem with that argument was that it collided directly with the fundamental structural difference between a single choke point and a networked redundant system. A choke point can be closed by successfully threatening one location. A network system requires simultaneously disabling multiple geographically dispersed nodes, each capable of absorbing the load of the others when one is disrupted. When the fuel depot near Dubai took damage, Yanbu absorbed the additional volume. When Omani facilities were struck, Fujairah handled the overflow. The strikes created disruptions. They did not create closure. Disruptions, unlike total closure, can be priced into shipping markets, absorbed through operational flexibility, and managed without triggering the complete economic paralysis that Iran's strategy required. Iran was attempting to demonstrate that the bypass was as vulnerable as a single strait. What it demonstrated instead was precisely the opposite. The redundancy was real, it was operational. And no combination of drone strikes available to Iran could replicate the effect of closing a 2-mile-wide corridor that every ship was compelled to use. The permanent answer to Iranian leverage requires something more fundamental than pipelines and ports. It requires reshaping the physical geography itself. This is the conversation accelerating in government ministries, engineering firms, and geological survey offices, pointing toward ambitions so large in scale they were previously dismissed as too expensive and too complex to take seriously outside academic literature. The Muzindam Canal is the most dramatic concept under serious government-level evaluation. The Muzindam Peninsula is the northernmost tip of Oman, a finger of mountainous terrain extending toward the strait. At its narrowest point, the distance between the Persian Gulf side and the Gulf of Oman side is between 20 and 50 kilometers of solid rock. Cut a canal through that rock wide enough and deep enough for the world's largest supertankers, and those vessels can exit the Persian Gulf directly into open ocean without entering Iranian territorial waters, without transiting the mined corridor, without passing within range of Iranian missiles, fast boats, or electronic warfare systems. The geographic logic is close to perfect. The geological reality is staggering. The Hayar Mountains rise to 2,000 meters. The rock is oolite and limestone compressed by millions of years of tectonic activity into one of the hardest geological formations modern excavation equipment regularly encounters, a canal capable of handling supertankers 300 meters long and weighing over 300,000 tons must be at least 25 meters deep and between 200 and 300 meters wide across the entire route. Cost estimates place the realistic figure between $200 and $300 billion. The Panama Canal's recent expansion cost $5 billion. The Muzindam project multiplies that reference figure between 40 and 60 times. The construction carries significant seismic risk. Environmental assessments describe the dredging operation as irreversibly altering the regional ecosystem, and yet the governments most directly affected are funding the studies because the strategic gains outweigh even this extraordinary bill. The strategic logic animating this entire effort points toward something analysts are beginning to describe as the era of geoengineering warfare, the recognition that states possessing sufficient financial and technical resources no longer need to compete for control of terrain when they have the alternative of altering the terrain itself. carving a canal through a mountain range, laying pipelines beneath a desert, building ports at geographic positions that sit outside an adversary's weapons envelope entirely. These are asymmetric moves that neutralize geographic leverage without requiring direct military confrontation with the adversary holding that leverage. When tankers stop transiting the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's entire Hormuz weapons architecture becomes strategically meaningless. 6,000 naval mines designed for shallow confined waters, fast boats optimized for the strait's specific dimensions, missile batteries zeroed on shipping lanes that ships no longer use, jamming systems covering a corridor that has been rendered commercially irrelevant, weapons pointed at a corridor that nobody uses are not deterrents, they are expensive inventory. Iran's 40 years of asymmetric military investment in the strait's geography requires ships to actually be there for any of it to matter. The bypass architecture removes that requirement, not by defeating the weapons, not by building technical countermeasures to neutralize them, simply by rerouting ships around them permanently so the weapons are never called upon to perform the function they were designed for. Iran's entire post-revolutionary deterrence doctrine was built on the Hormuz card. Its nuclear program generated influence partly because it operated in the shadow of the Hormuz threat, its proxy network. Across Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria projected power partly because Hormuz leverage gave Tehran the weight to sustain those relationships. Its negotiating position in every diplomatic context was shaped by the implicit economic catastrophe that strait closure represented. Remove the Hormuz card and every element of this architecture becomes less credible and more expensive to maintain simultaneously. The maps of the Earth have been redrawn before by people with construction equipment and the patience to use it. The Panama Canal reshaped global maritime trade. The Suez Canal changed the strategic calculus of empires. What is being built now across the Saudi desert, through the way mountain passes, and into the geological complexity of the Hayar Mountains belongs in that same category of world-altering infrastructure. The bypass pipelines are already operational. Korfakan is already handling diverted cargo. The Petroline is running at full capacity. The engineering teams are already in the mountains with their geological surveys and their cost models. When the canal eventually opens, the waters of the Strait of Hormuz will still flow between its shores. Ships will still technically be able to transit it. Iran will still control its northern coastline. But the tankers carrying the energy that powers the global economy will no longer be passing through it. The 40-year card that Tehran believed was permanent will have been quietly, patiently, and irreversibly cancelled, not by a missile, not by a battle, by a pipeline buried in a desert 45 years ago by people who understood that the most powerful strategic moves are the ones that take decades to execute and cannot be undone once completed. Saudi Arabia and the way have not defeated Iran militarily. They have done something more durable than military victory. They have made Iran's most important strategic asset obsolete through patient and sustained infrastructure investment. The weapon still exists. The threat can still technically be made, but the weapon's impact has been permanently reduced, and it will be reduced further with every additional pipeline connected, every port upgraded, and every meter of canal carved through those ancient mountains. That is the most consequential strategic defeat any nation can experience, and unlike the outcomes of wars, it will not end when the fighting stops. It will be permanent.